After building villages that can accommodate both its civilians and the military in Indian territory it has been illegally occupying since 1959 in the Arunachal sector, China is now busy building villages well inside Bhutan. Latest satellite imagery that have reached the Indian security establishment show that the Chinese have built at least 2 major villages well inside territory which Bhutan claims its own. The site of construction is less than 30 kilometers from the Doklam Plateau, where the Chinese and Indian troops had a lengthy standoff in 2017. Reports say clearing and construction activity in the area began in 2020 but accelerated last year. Bhutan is tight-lipped on the reports as part of government policy, but experts monitoring the development say that China, by building these settlements in a treacherous terrain, could be trying to compel the Bhutanese to engage with Beijing on the long-standing boundary dispute as a sovereign, independent entity outside India's shadow. It is well known that Bhutan has been a traditional ally of India, with New Delhi having a say in key areas such as security and development. I spoke to Dr. Swaran Singh, professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and a top China expert. And he said China has interests in the Siliguri Corridor that connects the 8 northeastern states to the Indian mainland, and therefore the Chinese activity along Bhutan's western borders is a matter of concern. Professor Swaran Singh added the Chinese are bent on increasing the staying power of PLA troopers in frontier areas, and therefore the focus on building villages, roads and taking electricity to the far-flung border stretches. I'm now joined by Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, by far one of India's best known experts on China. Professor Swaran Singh, welcome to Northeast Live. Dr. Swaran Singh, you are obviously aware of the fact that there are innumerable reports coming out now that the Chinese have started building several villages well within Bhutan's territory. What are your initial reactions? What do you think of this development?
I think it really marks, Basweer, a change in China's overall strategy in dealing with its neighbors, where it believes it has claims on additional territories than it has currently. We have seen China behaving fairly aggressively with all the neighbors, following a strategy of 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. This is how it has virtually taken over South China Sea, which is a great example of that strategy. When it comes to a country like India, it has seen that that kind of strategy is not able to deliver because India is able to stand up to China. If China, deploys 50,000 troops in frontier areas, so does India. Or we have seen in 2017 in Doklam crisis, India can stand up eyeball to eyeball for a longer period as well, for up to 10 weeks. So it is a change in China's strategy from 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, to now ensuring long-term, large-sized forward deployments in terms of focusing on tiring out the adversary or the neighboring country. And in that sense, this is part of infrastructure building, which China has been doing for the last 30 years in the border areas. But now primarily focusing on modernizing these villages across the border in frontier areas to make them as support systems for continuous long-term forward deployment of People's Armed Police and People's Liberation Army, so that they can continuously for longer term be deployed in forward areas in order to sort of.
So, Dr. Swaran Singh, you are saying that it is could be a part of China's well-calculated strategy to increase the staying power of the People's Liberation Army and other support staff in frontier areas, whether it is the frontier with Bhutan, whether it is on the frontier with India.
Exactly, Basweer, you're right. It is fundamentally staying power competition which Chinese are now focusing on. And for staying power, as you and me know very well, the People's Liberation Army and People's Armed Police are primarily Han dominated, and they are not very capable of staying long term in such high altitude forward areas. And therefore, potentially, China is developing hundreds. The last figure that came out from Chinese documents was 620 villages were being developed. So it's partly next to Bhutan and all across the border with India, where these villages are being modernized and developed to become support systems not only in supporting the current PAP and PLA, but potentially because strategy is long term, it is aiming even to treat those villages for recruitment because those people are far more acclimatized to these high altitude areas, they are familiar with those areas. So it's a long term strategy. And you remember they have just passed last year a land border law which became effective from 1st of January this year. And it is law that outlines this long term strategy of staying power being the focus of China in dealing with a major adversary like India, which is not allowing China to move forward at all.
Now, what does it imply as far as India's security is concerned, particularly the security of Northeast India? Because, if you look at the location where these new villages are coming up, about 9 to 30 kilometers short of that Doklam Plateau where the standoff took place in 2017, do you think that the Chinese are basically eyeing the Siliguri Corridor trying to build some kind of a military axis targeting the Siliguri Corridor or the chicken snake?
There is absolutely no doubt that right from very beginning, this is the area where Chinese have always felt vulnerable to India being on heights on in Bhutan on one side, in Sikkim on the other. And this triangular area is where they do not have the advantage of heights, and that is why Doklam has been the focus to not just expand the width of that triangle, but jet out also greater capabilities towards India's Siliguri corridor area. And we have known it that the Chinese have always been for about 15 years during their negotiations with the Bhutan from early 80s, saying that they are willing to give them twice as much the territory in the disputed claims in the north if they let China hold this 90 square kilometers of Doklam area. From 2020, China has in fact raised another claim in the eastern Sektang Wildlife Sanctuary area in the eastern part of Bhutan. And these are going to be perhaps also bargaining, style of China, bargaining chip of China to say that please allow us gradually to control this Doklam area in lieu of taking larger territories that China claims in north and now also from 2020 in the east. But I think this gradually is part of that whole infrastructure building, which is also going to perhaps hope from the Chinese side that the Bhutan will see it as a fait accompli for them. And finally, find that bargain of swapping territories much more attractive. And I think India has to be very careful. So it's not only when China starts building villages next to Bhutan areas or next to Arunachal Pradesh, it is part of an overall strategy that China has with the eye on India. Because even in case of Bhutan, it is India that stands up to China. It's not just when it comes to Indian borders. So this building of infrastructure is long-term strategy with an eye on India.
Right. Finally, Dr. Swaran Singh, what should be India's response now, according to you?
I think it has to be multi-pronged approach of building good partnerships with all neighboring countries of China. And you're hearing that the recent sort of missile deal for supplying BrahMos to Philippines. We are in advanced negotiations with Indonesia, Vietnam, and other countries, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. So in that sense, building a close cooperation with the entire periphery of China, that's one. Making our defense sector far more autonomous and independent, self-reliant. For example, Prime Minister last year mentioned that India's defense exports should cross $5 billion by 2025. And in that sense, also allowing greater focus on defense exports. We now have a special office in the Department of Defense Production to look after these exports. India has expanded the foreign direct investments into government to government cooperation, 100% government to private cooperation, 74%. So, making India's defense sector far more self sufficient, self reliant, and also obtaining access to modern technologies. So, when we talk of Make in India, all these defense sector is looking at defense transfers of defense technologies to
Right.
India to make India's defense sector more competitive, more self reliant. Because when it
Right.
comes to staying power being the focus, India has to also likewise prepare for itself, not just in dealing with one or two episodes on the line of actual control, but focus on infrastructure building, giving welfare, giving advantages to our
Right.
people in frontier
Right.
areas. So
Yeah.
India also has to build frontier areas, not just in terms of military management, but also civilian infrastructure, which is going to support armed forces in frontier areas.
Articulate as always, Dr. Swaran Singh. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to Northeast Live. The satellite images also show heavy earth moving equipments, camouflage structures, and houses, some of them two-storied, in the area. New construction activities have also been noted. China's foreign ministry said it was within the country's sovereign rights to carry out any activity within its territory. The construction, the Chinese foreign ministry said, is entirely for the improvement of the working and living conditions of the local people. These dual-use villages, experts believe, would allow the Chinese far greater access to control or monitor remote frontier areas and later help them build security installations or listening posts. For 4 decades now, Bhutan, a Himalayan nation of 800,000 people, have been engaged in boundary negotiations with China to resolve the dispute. In April 2021, Bhutan and China decided to speed up the process of resolving their differences within the framework of the boundary talks. I also spoke to Claude Arpi, French-born Tibetologist who lives in India, on the developments. Let's listen in to what he had to say on the reports on China building villages inside Bhutan. I have with me Mr. Claude Arpi, well-known Tibetologist and commentator. Mr. Claude Arpi, must have seen definitely reports about China constructing villages well within Bhutanese territory. What do you make of it? What do you think?
So it's not the first time. And of course, we all remember the Doklam incident when in June 2017, China started building a road on the Bhutanese territory. So China has been doing it again and again. Doklam was different. There was an access to the border, and the Indian troops could intervene and stop that road, which would have jeopardized the Siliguri Corridor. But in that case, both are in the north of Bhutan. One is northeast of Bhutan, and the other one is more in central Bhutan, in the north also.
No, Mr.
So
Arpi,
this is very serious because it shows that China can do this thing with impunity.
Mr. Arpi, why do you think,
Mr. Arpi, what has happened in Ladakh in May of 2020, if the Indian army had not been strong and not sent more than 50,000 troops, same thing would have happened. Bhutan, unfortunately, the Royal Bhutanese Army doesn't have the strength to resist this Chinese advance, but that is a very dangerous precedent. And it shows again that China is very hegemonistic in its approach.
Now, Mr. Arpi, what kind of a security implication can this move have as far as India is concerned? Do you think the Chinese are actually eyeing at the Siliguri Corridor with an aim to focus on Northeast India?
Regarding the Siliguri Corridor, I think China has realized that if anything happened in the Doklam area, India would intervene militarily, which is not possible in the north, where I just mentioned these two examples in the north, where several villages have been built. And you have to remember also that there's indication for India, because China has built a village which is south of the international border in Arunachal, in Upper Subansari district of Arunachal, that Longju village. And another one also, more eastern ones, south of the Meiling airport in Tibet. So it has happened twice, also on the Indian territory. And of course, the Indian government said that these places are north of the LAC, but somehow it's playing with the LAC and IB, which may differ a few kilometers. And China, in that case, have used these discrepancies between LAC and IB to set up villages there. And as you're aware, China has built 600 villages on the Tibetan plateau. Many of them are very close to the border, and it creates a new environment for India. The demography of the border with the northeast, with Arunachal, has been totally changed because China, in these villages, which were not existing, like the Bhutanese villages mentioned by Reuters, these villages were not existing 2-3 years ago. So it means that China is bringing people from outside, and in my opinion, it will be 50% from Tibet and 50% from the mainland Han Chinese. So it completely changed the demography. And once again, in the case of Bhutan, Bhutan cannot do much militarily in this remote place in the north. And further that, these places which are so-called disputed, Bhutan and China since 1984 had several rounds of talks, more than 20 rounds of talks, and they were considered as a bargaining chip for the Doklam area that China wanted. But now they have taken away, so that also changed the negotiation that Bhutan has with China. And Bhutan being too weak is put in front of a fait accompli.
Okay, finally, Mr. Claude Arpey, do you think India has a role at all? Because this is China occupying or constructing villages in Bhutan. We of course know that India and Bhutan share a very, very close relationship.
India, as I mentioned earlier, cannot intervene militarily. In the case of Doklam in June 2017, it was different. There was an access for the troops, Indian troops, to come and stop the road. But in that case, there is no way that India can intervene militarily. Now, diplomatically, certainly India will first discuss with Bhutan and eventually take the issue with China. But history has shown that China is not listening to anything. China is listening only when you stop them physically, like it was done in Ladakh. And now we had 2-3 days ago the 14th round of talk. We don't know if some breakthrough will happen in the next few months, but the only thing China can understand is to be blocked physically by the Indian troops, and which is not possible in the case of northern Bhutan. But it has serious implication for the Bhutan-China negotiation. And I don't see now next time how Bhutanese can go to China to negotiate something when China has taken by force these areas and built villages. And I have to add that one more village has been built, which is east of Doklam, along the Amochu, is the river which going to India, to Punsoling, and they're 3-4 kilometers inside the Bhutanese territory. A village was built last year, and everybody has been quiet about it, but it's another example of China hegemonistic tendencies, and which are very difficult to stop for Bhutan, of course, and for India also.
Mr. Claude Arpey, well-known Tibetologist and commentator, thank you very much for speaking to Northeast Live.
Thank you. Thank you.
The big question now is whether China is desperately trying to force open a military axis targeting the Siliguri Corridor or the Chicken Neck to focus on Northeast India. Or is China trying to unsettle the Bhutan-India bond of trust and friendship and compel Thimphu to engage with Beijing more and more? One has to wait and watch.